when it comes to the far right, or the far left, I suppose, to some extent, but when we had sort of rises of right-wing populism previously in history, it was usually very popular amongst young men with very little opportunity and very little chance and very little education. And that is how lots of right-wing despots rose to power. And that is exactly the same kind of demographic that was seen looting and stealing and setting buses on fire and so on in Ireland. It's not particularly an ideology. That's just a problem with society.
Raise the issue of the far right. And obviously we've had the Dutch election in the last few days, Geert Wilders winning that.
Be careful about far right. Be careful about far right. I don't think the groundswell of opinion in Britain, in Ireland generally, and certainly not in Netherlands, is far right.
Well, no, but if you look at Italy, Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, I mean, you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary.
She's a Thatcherite. She's a Thatcherite.
She's described by everyone as far right.
No, she's described by you as far right. If you look at what she's done, nothing that she's done has been far right at all.
All mainstream media organisations in the UK call her far right.
No, they do not.
They do.
The BBC calls her far right. Loads of people. The Times call her far right.
The BBC calls Giorgia Meloni far right. Of course it does. The BBC calls everything which it doesn't agree with as far right. There is no way on earth that Meloni is far right. She's a Thatcherite. She's right wing. She's there are plenty of issues upon which I would fervently disagree with her on those causes. But it's not basically. It's rather like at the turn of this century when there was a growth in organisations which were called far right, but actually people like Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands were not really far right at all. They were social democrats in many cases, and certainly that's what we saw in Slovakia. That was a social democrat victory back in October. So that wasn't far right, but it was anti-immigration. So it's the issue of immigration. Ireland's a different issue. Unquestionably, there are far right and properly called far right rabble risers like Michael O'Keefe causing problems. But nonetheless, there is still within the population an unease about the level of immigration there has been, the amount of immigration there is to come, no end in sight, and people are getting angry about it. But I don't think that necessarily means it's a far right issue.
Okay, well, I've done a quick Google. Politico, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, AP News, Euronews, CNBC, The New York Times, the list goes on. They all call her far right.
Yeah, well,
let's agree to disagree on that, but that's not the point I want to get into.
No, we won't agree to disagree because there is something called the truth. Now,
but that's the truth. All I'm saying is the truth is that is the way she is recorded by media organisations.
Some media organisations, not by those in Italy. Not by those in Italy, and not by many, many papers over here. You won't find the Telegraph referring to her as far right. They will call her right wing. She's a Thatcherite.
Actually, they have got an article where they call her far right, but it's in inverted commas because I've just checked. Anyway, the point I wanted to get to with Susie was, to bring her into the conversation, is when you look at the number of far-right politicians that are getting more votes across Europe and indeed in Argentina, is there a perception that the far right is on the march, or do you think there really is a sense that politics is moving further to the right and dangerously so?
That we've had an era of populism. I don't know if the era is fully over yet. Australia, of course, has a lot of problems with immigration, a lot of problems with racism, and they've just elected sort of a fairly progressive centre-left Keir Starmer type figure, Albanese. So it has been considered that maybe that era is coming to an end and we're entering a different one. But I think whether someone is far right or far left really depends where you stand on the spectrum, usually. And so although there is a truth and a non-truth, there's no real objective truth when you talk about where someone is in the political scale, because it's either to the left or the right of you and things like that. And one of the problems that we've got in this country is that we we think about things in that kind of binary term. There's right and there's left and there's center, and that's kind of it. Whereas lots of the conflicts around the world, lots of other countries, lots of cultures, the Middle East is a perfect example of it. They've got right and left politics, but they also have religious, more extreme and less extreme, more secular, more fundamentalist. They also have ethnic politics, and things are not binary like that everywhere else. And for example, in Northern Ireland, you've got obviously historical problems between sectarianism and rabble rousers, as Rod says, and individuals who are benefiting from trouble and conflict and strife. So that's also part of it. But, when it comes to the far right, or the far left, I suppose, to some extent, but when we had sort of rises of right-wing populism previously in history, it was usually very popular amongst young men with very little opportunity and very little chance and very little education. And that is how lots of right-wing despots rose to power. And that is exactly the same kind of demographic that was seen looting and stealing and setting buses on fire and so on in Ireland. It's not particularly an ideology. That's just a problem with society. And I think we've sort of forgotten that bit of society hasn't gone anywhere. And it hasn't been fixed. It hasn't been helped. It's always been there, and it's always going to be there unless someone helps it out in some way. And if we don't help it out and we ignore it and pretend everything's fine because we're all so grown up now, then they'll come back out now and again and set fire to buses. And you have to do something about it. There's always a risk that they will come back. We fought the Second World War and thought that's the end of far right, and it isn't.